Nevada, August 1945. The sun blazed relentlessly over the camp, turning barbed wire and wooden barracks into a shimmering mirage heat. Japanese prisoners of war shuffled across the yard, their limbs thin, their movements heavy with exhaustion. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka moved among them, once a soldier of honor for his emperor, now hollow-cheeked and silent. A guard handed him a metal cup slick with condensation, and his hand shook as he accepted it. For days he had watched the Americans drink from these strange dark bottles, Coca-Cola, lifting them as casually as if it were nothing more than water. For a man who had survived on meager gruel and wild roots, it seemed like a forbidden luxury. Fear and suspicion coiled in his stomach. Would it be poison, a trap? The warnings of his homeland echoed in his mind. The barbarians would show no mercy. Steeling himself, he brought the cup to his lips. The liquid was sweet. It was not what he expected. It was something else entirely. A shock to every sense he had left. A burst of sweetness, sharp and fizzing, surges across his tongue like fire and ice at once. The sensation is so alien, so overwhelming, that he nearly gasps. For a moment he forgets where he is. He forgets he is a prisoner. What he tastes is not just a drink. It is a glimpse into another world, a world of impossible abundance. Across the yard, another revelation. An American guard, a boy barely old enough to shave, chews his hamburger absent-mindedly. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tosses the half-eaten remains into a trash barrel. The meat lands with a soft, careless slap. Tanaka stares. His breath catches. Then, to his own shame, the tears come. He weeps, not from cruelty, not from pain, but from the unbearable contrast. Back in Japan, his family fought for scraps. His comrades dug through jungle mud for roots, for anything to fill their bellies. In Tokyo, mothers boiled weeds for broth. A soldier's ration was a few ounces of rice when rice could be found at all. And here, the enemy wastes meat? Even prisoners drink a sweet nectar that would be a treasure at home? In that moment, Tanaka realized something more terrifying than death. Everything he had been taught, everything his nation had promised, was a lie. Whispers ripple through the barracks. Why would the Americans feed them? Why waste food on enemies? They had been told Americans were weak, soft, too spoiled to endure real war. Radios in Japan declared that U.S. soldiers lived on candy and Coca-Cola, that without luxuries they would crumble. Yet here they stood, surrounded by proof that luxuries in America were not signs of weakness, but of an unimaginable strength. This was not propaganda. This was reality, unavoidable and crushing. Every discarded hamburger, every overflowing cup, became a weapon far more devastating than bullets. It was abundance, flaunted not with arrogance, but with casual indifference. America was so strong it could afford to feed its enemies better than Japan could feed its own people. For Tanaka and the others, the shock went deeper than hunger. It was ideological. The empire had promised that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that willpower was greater than industry. But standing under the Nevada sun holding a bottle of Coca-Cola, they saw the truth. Spirit alone could not fill an empty stomach. Willpower could not conjure beef from the air. A nation that could waste more than its enemies possessed had already won a war of a different kind. So why did Japanese prisoners cry over hamburgers and soda? Because in those small ordinary moments they tasted the collapse of their world view. They saw that victory belonged not to those who suffered most, but to those who could produce most. Every fizz of soda, every scrap of wasted meat was a lesson. America's strength was not just in weapons, but in the sheer overwhelming capacity to provide. Tanaka's trembling sip, his tears in the desert sun, were the first cracks in an empire's myth. The battle was not only fought on beaches or in jungles. It was fought here, in the stomach and in the soul. And this was only the beginning. For if a sip of Coca-Cola could shatter belief, what would happen when the prisoners faced a mountain of meat, or the strange revolutionary freedom of choosing what to buy in an American canteen? The morning after their arrival, the prisoners were ordered to line up outside the infirmary. The desert air was sharp and dry, and the men shuffled forward with the heavy silence of exhaustion. Sergeant Tanaka, still dazed from the shock of Coca-Cola, joined the line. In front of him stood comrades who had fought in Burma, the Philippines, Okinawa, faces carved by hunger, eyes dulled by fatigue. A U.S. Army medic with a clipboard called out names in a flat voice. Each prisoner stepped forward, boots scraping the gravel, and mounted the scale. The pencil scratched across paper. The ritual repeated. Name, weight, height, notes. What the Americans recorded that morning shocked even men who had spent years in war hospitals. The ledgers told the story with clinical clarity. The average Japanese prisoner was nearly 20% under the American standard for a healthy adult male. Bones jutted beneath sallow skin. Cheeks were hollow. Malnutrition was universal. Private Minaruka weighed just 108 pounds when he stepped onto the scale. Sergeant Hajime Kondo, once a sturdy infantryman, barely reached 116 pounds. The numbers were not just statistics, they were evidence of a defeated nation starving itself to continue fighting. Yet the miracle came quickly. Within days of arriving, those numbers began to change. On August 12th, Private Kote was weighed again. He had gained 4 pounds. By the 14th, he was up 7. 2 weeks after capture, he stood at 115 pounds. His medical chart marked in red pencil with a curt notation. Digestive reacclimatization complete. This was not an isolated case. The September records list similar jumps. Sergeant Kondo gained 9 pounds in his first 2 weeks. Private First Class Kenji Yamada added 7. The data astonished even the hardened camp medics. These men who had arrived gaunt and skeletal were filling out with a speed that bordered on miraculous. The Americans compared the figures to those of German prisoners who had also suffered at the front. The Germans gained weight too, but not like this. The Japanese, whose rations in the jungle had often dropped below 200 calories a day, responded to the 3,800-calorie American diet as though their bodies were desperate sponges soaking up life. The contrast was stark. In Manila, a soldier's ration had been millet gruel and a few scraps of dried fish, sometimes washed down with rainwater collected in rusty cans. At Camp 371 in Nebraska, the ration lists included white bread, beef stew, mashed potatoes, butter, milk, and Coca-Cola. One world measured food in single grains of rice. The other measured it in calories so plentiful that even prisoners could hardly consume them all. Dr. Hans Keller, in his inspection report, wrote, "Visible improvement in physical condition. Prisoners appear confused by abundance." The phrase was clinical, almost cold. But to the prisoners themselves, that confusion was profound. They were not simply gaining weight. They were confronting a reality that shattered their training and their belief. At night, in the barracks, the whispers returned. Was this real food? Could it be poisoned? But the scales bid not lie. Each morning the men were heavier. Their bodies, long starved, were betraying their suspicions. Every pound gained was a quiet admission that America was not what they had been told. For Tanaka, the shock was deeply personal. He remembered the long marches in Burma when men collapsed from hunger, when soldiers gnawed bark to quiet their stomachs. He remembered comrades left behind, too weak to stand because rations had run out. And now, in captivity, his body grew stronger, not weaker. His muscles filled, his skin gained color, his steps grew steadier. The humiliation was sharp. The enemy had done for him what his own empire could not. This was the mathematics of survival, written in ledgers and lived in flesh. Numbers alone could not capture the storm inside the prisoners' minds, but they told a truth that could not be denied. In America, even the enemies of the state ate better than the loyal soldiers of Japan. What happens when men who expected to die in captivity find themselves growing healthier instead? What happens when the numbers on a scale defy years of propaganda? The answer lay not only in their stomachs, but in their spirits. The body was recovering. The mind, however, was beginning to fracture, because abundance does not come without suspicion. And when the meals grew richer, when trays of beef and bread appeared steaming in the mess hall, suspicion would soon turn to fear. If the shock of weight gain was dramatic, wait until you see what happened the first time they sat down to a feast of American meat. The mess hall at Camp 371 buzzed with unease. Rows of Japanese prisoners clutched their trays, the smell of hot beef stew and fresh white bread filling the air. For men who had survived on boiled millet, bitter roots, and rainwater, the sight was overwhelming. So overwhelming that suspicion drowned out hunger. Sergeant Hajime Kondo, who had fought in the mud and jungle of Burma, stared at his tray. The thick slice of beef glistened in a pool of gravy. Steam rose from mashed potatoes that looked impossibly white, impossibly soft. His hands shook as he gripped the metal tray tighter. To him, this was not food, it was a trap. He glanced at the American guards by the door. They were chatting and laughing, utterly unconcerned, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. Their indifference made the feast all the more terrifying. Across the table, Private First Class Kenji Yamada pressed a finger into the bun of his hamburger, his brow furrowed. He had never seen bread so soft, meat so rich. To him, the texture felt wrong, too pliable, too perfect. He leaned in to whisper, "It looks like food, but what if it isn't?" The other men nodded grimly. For years they had been told Americans were cruel barbarians. If this wasn't poison, it was surely some trick. At first, the prisoners nibbled cautiously. Small bites of bread, tiny sips of milk. Some forced themselves to chew slowly, analyzing each mouthful for hidden danger. Then the reactions came. Within minutes, dozens of men doubled over. By the end of the meal, the camp infirmary was overwhelmed. The August 15th medical log records 36 cases of acute vomiting and dietary shock. The Japanese bodies, long accustomed to starvation diets of less than half their required calories, simply could not handle the sudden flood of fat, sugar, and protein. Kondo collapsed behind the barracks, retching until he shook. Yamada stumbled into the infirmary, sweating, convinced the hamburger had been laced with poison. Their fear spread like wildfire. Rumors swept through the compound. They were being fattened for experiments, for slaughter, for grotesque rituals of cannibalism. Men whispered in the dark that the bread was laced with chemicals, the milk with drugs. The Americans were baffled. To them, it was just food, ordinary mass-produced meals that any soldier or worker might eat. Some guards tried to reassure the prisoners, even eating from the same trays, but suspicion clung stubbornly. OSS intelligence reports noted the psychological shock with fascination. Prisoners reject abundance as deception. Trust in enemy intentions remained non-existent. For days, trays were returned half-eaten. Bread was left untouched, beef scraped into garbage bins. To the prisoners, the waste confirmed their worst fears. Why would guards toss aside food unless they had more sinister plans? Why would abundance appear here, in a place of captivity, if not to mask cruelty? The truth was simpler yet more devastating. America had more food than it knew what to do with. For the guards, a half-eaten hamburger meant nothing. For the prisoners, each wasted bite was a dagger of disbelief. In the barracks, Kondo wrestled with the contradiction. His stomach was stronger now, recovering from weeks of malnutrition, but his mind could not accept what his body proved. Every bite he managed to keep down was evidence against the ideology he had lived by. He had been trained to expect cruelty, to see Americans as monsters, yet the reality before him was generosity so vast it felt unreal. And this was the deeper poison. Not the meat, not the milk, not the Coke. The true poison was abundance itself. Abundance so casual, so careless, that it shattered everything they thought they knew. What happens when men prepared for brutality encounter kindness? When warriors hardened by starvation are undone not by bullets, but by bread? In those mess halls, the battle was not against hunger, but against belief, and it was a battle the prisoners were losing. But the real shock was still to come, for if the first meals brought confusion and fear, what awaited them next was something beyond imagination. Not just trays of food, but entire mountains of meat. If the first taste of abundance was overwhelming, wait until prisoners were confronted with America's endless river of beef. The summer of 1944 brought a sight so surreal that many Japanese prisoners could hardly process it. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, 5 refrigerated rail cars rattled into the siding, their steel doors frosted white in the humid heat. The quartermaster signed the manifest with a shake of his head. Inside 200,000 pounds of frozen beef. To the Americans, it was routine. To the prisoners, who watched from the fence line, it was incomprehensible. Corporal Akira Okamoto, once a farmer's son from rural Kyushu, was assigned to the kitchens. When the doors swung open, he stepped into the rail car and froze. Hanging from hooks were entire sides of beef, row upon row, a forest of carcasses gleaming in the cold light. The smell of raw meat filled his nostrils, heavy and metallic. He had seen his family celebrate once over a single dried fish. Now before his eyes was enough meat to feed a Japanese village for months. Here it was just another weekly delivery. Okamoto's orders were clear: butcher 2,000 pounds of beef every week for the Japanese compound alone. Day after day, he and his crew sharpened knives, carving steaks, dicing roasts, grinding hundreds of hamburger patties. The kitchen logs from that summer read like a ledger of excess: beef stew on Monday, roast brisket on Wednesday, savory hash on Friday. There was always more, always enough to serve seconds, always leftovers scraped into bins. The waste was what broke them. American guards pressed for time or appetite would take 2 careless bites from a hamburger and toss the rest into the trash. Prisoners stared in silence. In Japan, wasting even a single grain of rice was a moral failing. To watch meat thrown away as if it were nothing was not simply shocking, it was obscene. Private Shiro Abe, in a diary later found after the war, captured the despair. In Japan, rice was fortune, beans were luxury. Here, Americans feed us meat with both hands, then throw the rest away. We are ashamed to eat, ashamed to watch. His words echoed the sentiment that spread through the camp. Each untouched portion scraped from a tray into the bin was another reminder that America's capacity seemed infinite, while Japan's had collapsed into starvation. Red Cross inspectors, with their usual clinical language, noted storerooms that never emptied and mess lines that never ended. But their words could not capture the psychological storm. For the prisoners, the meat was not just food, it was proof. Proof that America's strength was not a facade, not propaganda, but a daily reality. The empire had promised that spirit and sacrifice could overcome material weakness, yet here was material abundance so vast that even prisoners could not dent it. Okamoto later admitted that he began to dread his kitchen duty. Cutting beef no longer felt like labor, it felt like humiliation. Every slab of meat he prepared was a reminder that his nation could not provide even rice for its soldiers, while America could drown its enemies in protein. Each pound he trimmed was another measure of defeat, and yet the Americans treated it all as ordinary. To them, meat was not treasure, it was Tuesday. That casualness was the most devastating lesson of all. For a prisoner who once believed Japan's struggle was noble, it was unbearable to realize that the enemy's abundance was not even effort. So what happens when your enemy's leftovers equal your nation's feast? What happens when the sight of waste wounds more deeply than the wounds of war? In the storerooms and garbage bins of Camp Shelby, Japanese prisoners confronted a truth that no battlefield could reveal. Their empire was starving, and America was so rich it could throw victory away and still have more. The mountain of meat was more than sustenance. It was a monument to power, a daily reminder that they were up against a nation whose strength was not just military, but industrial, agricultural, and cultural. And that realization prepared them unknowingly for an even greater shock, because if food could humiliate, what about freedom? If the mountain of meat shattered their pride, the camp canteen would challenge something even deeper, their very understanding of choice and liberty. The mess halls had shown the prisoners America's overwhelming material power, but it was the camp canteen, the PX, that revealed something even more dangerous. Not in the sense of guns or barbed wire, but in the quiet, subversive way it cracked open minds. Here, behind the fences, the prisoners encountered a concept they had never truly known: choice. Each man, after a day of labor clearing fields, repairing fences, or working in nearby farms, received payment. Not real dollars, but script. Coupons printed on plain paper, valid only inside the camp. To an American, it was ordinary, a bureaucratic convenience, but to the Japanese prisoners, who had lived under a rigid hierarchy where every aspect of life was dictated, even the smallest scrap of currency was revolutionary. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time in their lives, they could decide how to spend. Inside the squat, whitewashed building of the PX, shelves were stocked with unimaginable luxuries: chocolate bars wrapped in shiny foil, cigarettes in neat packs, soap with a perfumed scent that clung to the skin, cans of peaches bright with syrup, and always rows of Coca-Cola bottles resting in chipped metal coolers, their glass sweating in the Mississippi heat. Sergeant Katsuya, once a schoolteacher from Saitama, remembered his first purchase vividly. With his 80 cents of daily earnings, he bought a single scoop of vanilla ice cream. He carried it outside, sat on a wooden bench, and let it melt against his tongue. For a moment, he closed his eyes and thought of the rice cakes his mother once made during festival days. He nearly cried. A prisoner in enemy hands, tasting ice cream under the southern sun, feeling something like joy. Private Shiro Abe wrote in his diary of the day a shipment of Coca-Cola arrived. The staff rolled out a battered cooler filled with ice, the glass bottles clinking together as though celebrating. Prisoners lined up, script in hand, hesitant, curious. Abe watched the American guards first, saw them clink their bottles, drink deep, laugh without worry. Then he bought his own. In Japan, he wrote, "We boiled water and called it a feast. Here even prisoners drink like kings." Not every man chose sweets. Some used their scrip to buy soap, splitting it carefully into slivers. Others saved for pencils and paper, desperate to write letters home. Yet the act itself, the ability to choose, was intoxicating. In an empire where the state decided everything from rations to destiny, this small freedom was more shocking than 1,000 calories of beef. To the Americans, it was harmless. To the prisoners, it was a revelation. A society could be organized not around obedience, but around individual preference. The PX was not just a store, it was a classroom in democracy disguised in sugar and tobacco. Red Cross inspectors noted the canteen in their reports. Prisoners given the opportunity to purchase small luxuries with script earned from labor. Condition promotes morale. What they could not capture was the deeper effect. Men trained to surrender individuality to the collective were being introduced to the intoxicating currency of freedom, choice itself. Myriads recalled watching their comrades on what they called ice cream days. A delivery truck would bring frozen tubs, and men who had once starved in jungles now sat in the shade licking vanilla from their fingers. The irony was bitter. Their empire had demanded sacrifice unto death, yet here in captivity they tasted dignity. For Tanaka, the man who had once cried over a discarded hamburger, the PX was more dangerous than the mess hall. Food could fill the stomach, but choice filled the soul. He realized that the Americans were not only strong in industry, they were strong in a way Japan had never allowed its people to be. Each man's script was a reminder: even prisoners could exercise more personal freedom in America than free men could in Tokyo. So what happens when an empire built on obedience confronts the power of choice? What happens when men who are supposed to die for the collective find joy in a bottle of Coke or a scoop of ice cream? The PX was more than a shop. It was a window into a new kind of society, one that would linger in memory long after the fences came down. And if food had broken their bodies' resistance, freedom was beginning to dissolve their souls' defenses. If this glimpse into freedom surprised you, stay with me, because what came next, a simple 5-cent bottle of Coca-Cola, would become the ultimate symbol of America's power. By the autumn of 1945, there was one item in the camp canteen that eclipsed all others. It was not chocolate or cigarettes. It was not ice cream, soap, or canned fruit. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola. 5 cents, ice cold, capped with a twist of metal. For the Japanese prisoners, this simple drink became a symbol, a lesson, and a wound all at once. The logistics alone astonished them. Freight trains pulled into camp sidings carrying ammunition, medical supplies, uniforms, and entire cars filled with Coca-Cola. The syrup came from Atlanta, shipped in 55-gallon drums to bottling plants across the country. From there, the bottles rolled out on the same supply lines that carried tanks and rifles. For a nation starved of even rice, the revelation was staggering. America's war machine was so vast, so efficient, that it prioritized delivering soda to every soldier in every corner of the globe, and even to prisoners. To the Americans, it was ordinary. Coca-Cola was everywhere, as common as water. To the prisoners, it was something bordering on sorcery. When the cooler lid creaked open, revealing rows of sweating bottles, the men leaned forward, wide-eyed, as though witnessing magic. Guards would grab theirs first, clinking the glass, drinking deeply. Laughter carried on the summer air. Then the prisoners followed, clutching their script, uncertain but eager. The first taste was unforgettable. Sergeant Kenji Iwasaki later described it in a letter intercepted by censors. It is a festival in the mouth, sweeter than any fruit. It fizzes as if alive. He folded the red and light label into a tiny paper crane, keeping it as a talisman. Lieutenant Masuo Nakamura, in a postcard smuggled home, wrote simply, "I drank a bottle of American sugar. My tongue still remembers." The symbolism was devastating. In Japan, sugar had been rationed to near extinction. Children grew up without candy. Families sweetened rice with pine sap. Here, sweetness came not in grains, but in bottles, so abundant they were handed to captives. Every sip was both delight and humiliation. It was joy wrapped in defeat. Even the smallest details carried weight. Prisoners began collecting the caps, flattening them into keepsakes. Each cap represented not just a drink, but an impossible arithmetic. A nation rich enough to bottle happiness, ship it across oceans, and pour it into the hands of its enemies. For men taught that true power came from suffering, from discipline, from sacrifice. The bubbly sweetness dissolved their certainty like sugar in water. Captain Takashi Ito, older and more cynical, watched the younger men marvel at their bottles. In his diary he wrote with weary shame, "They waste nothing, yet they have too much. I am ashamed to envy my captors." His words captured the poison at the heart of abundance. It did not only fill bellies, it eroded loyalty. The prisoners could not escape the comparisons. In Tokyo, civilians boiled grass and bark to survive. In Nagasaki, children scavenged ashes for scraps. Yet here, in America, trains hauled soda as if it were ammunition. What kind of power could afford to make sweetness a strategic priority? For Tanaka, the man who had once trembled over his first sip, Coca-Cola became more than a drink. It was a reminder every time the fizz touched his tongue that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in the confidence to share its luxuries even with its enemies. Each bottle was a message. We have more than enough. We can afford to be generous. So what happens when the taste of sugar carries more weight than the sound of gunfire? What happens when a bottle of soda becomes proof that your nation's sacrifices were in vain? For the prisoners, Coca-Cola was not simply refreshment. It was defeat in liquid form, victory sealed under a metal cap. And yet, it was also the beginning of something else, because abundance once tasted could not be forgotten. When these men returned to their ruined homeland, the memory of Coke would follow them, sweet, fizzy, and impossible to erase. America's real weapons were not always bombs and bullets. They were hamburgers, ice cream, and Coca-Cola. In the final part, we see how these simple items dissolved ideology, and how the taste of freedom outlasted the war itself. What defeated the men of the Axis who found themselves behind American barbed wire was not a rifle shot or a bomb. It was a plate of food. It was a scoop of ice cream. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola. When Japanese and German prisoners stepped onto American soil, they braced themselves for cruelty. They had been told to expect starvation, humiliation, and barbarity. Instead, they found themselves in clean barracks with steady meals, humane treatment, and choices they had never known in their own homelands. For many, it was the first time in years they had slept without hunger gnawing at their bellies. The shock was not just physical, it was existential. The irony was cruel. On the battlefields, they had endured privation and believed their suffering gave them moral strength. Their propaganda promised that spiritual willpower would outlast America's supposed weakness. But inside the camps, they discovered that the very idea was a lie. America's power lay not in promises, but in proof. Proof served on trays, proof sold in canteens, proof fizzing in glass bottles. Every discarded hamburger, every untouched steak, every Coke cap flattened into a keepsake, chipped away at their certainty. They had prepared for the lash of an enemy's whip, but they were unprepared for the humiliation of generosity. And that generosity, careless and routine, carried more psychological weight than the heaviest artillery. To Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, who had wept at the sight of wasted meat, captivity became a mirror. He realized that his empire, which had demanded loyalty to death, could not even provide rice for its soldiers. To Corporal Akira Okamoto, who butchered endless sides of beef in Mississippi, the very act of cutting meat felt like carving his nation's failure into flesh. To Private Shiro Abe, who bought his first Coke with camp script, the fizz on his tongue was both joy and defeat. These men returned home carrying memories more dangerous than any weapon. The memory of abundance. In Japan, where cities lay in ruins and families scavenged ashes for food, former prisoners spoke of ice cream days, storerooms that never emptied, and guards who tossed meat into bins. Their words planted seeds. They revealed that America was not decadent and weak, but confident and impossibly rich. And those seeds mattered. They shaped how defeated nations looked at democracy, industry, and freedom itself. In the end, the most devastating weapon America wielded was not destruction, but demonstration. It showed that strength was measured not by how much one could endure without food, but how much one could produce without end. It showed that dignity was not in sacrifice, but in choice. It proved that freedom could taste like sugar, bread, and ice cream. This was America's quiet victory. Not the thunder of guns, but the hum of factories. Not the fire of bombs, but the hiss of soda bottles opening in the summer heat. The prisoners wept, not from cruelty, but from revelation. They saw a truth their leaders had hidden. A democracy of ordinary people could outproduce, outlast, and outlive an empire that demanded endless sacrifice. When they returned to their broken homelands, they were no longer the same men who had marched out to war. They were unwilling ambassadors of a new reality, carrying memories that whispered, "There is another way."